As someone that Gordon looked up to, we are privileged to have Gordon share his personal recollections of a master of ocean flying boats. Please help me welcome Gordon Werne.
Thank you very much. It's a distinct pleasure to be here. It's amazing how this show is turning out. I'm so pleased with it, and I kind of got the feeling it was going to be a hanger flying session at first, and now I'm, all I can say is I grew up around Joe Barrows, and I grew up around many of you in this room. My personal ambition was to get a job with Pan American as a pilot, and I tried to in 1967 when I interviewed with Don Kinkle here in San Francisco. He said, well, we're not really hiring right now, but we're interviewing, and we always like to have the apps. He says, by any chance, did any relative of yours ever work for Pan American Airways? He says, well, my uncle's a retired captain. He says, what was his name? I says, Joe Barrows. He says, hell, he hired me in 1942. Unfortunately, I never got a job with Pan American. Probably lucky for the company. That's the first airliner Joe Barrows ever flew right there. This is a little ahead of the game, but that was in 1925. That airplane was built at Clover Field in Santa Monica by Ken Monte. It's a Canuck Jenny with a Hisso engine. It had a 4-passenger cabin, and Joe used it, I'll get into it a little later, he used it in Northern California to run a flying service. But it was quite a nice airplane, and I remember Joe commenting to me one day, boy, that Ken Monte sure made nice airplanes. There's a couple good stories about that airplane too. That's to get the name straight. Oh, I think with this audience, I don't need to get too far into that. He died in 1983, and I spread his ashes from an airplane with the help of a friend about 10 miles outside of the Golden Gate, after a heck of a QB party the day before down in Fresno. Yeah, he got a good send-off. There's Joe. I don't think you've ever seen him looking that innocent before, but he was 6 months old, and that was September. That was in 1903. He was born down in San Jacinto. There's a little later, about 1941 or 40, about the time he made chief pilot. He had red hair, and he was known as Joe Red Barrows. His initials were WJ. He was never called William. He was always Joe or Red or other things. I grew up in Saratoga, and he had a large ranch down there. But he was a contemporary of, his seniority goes back to 1932. I remember when this brochure came out in the early 50s, there's good old Kenny Beer, and I had the very good pleasure, as many of you did, of knowing Ken Beer. I also knew Jack Tilton, spent a couple nights out at his house hearing stories, and it was a pleasure. I'm sorry I didn't spend more time there. Audrey Dursk, I never met. No, that was Turner. Dursk, I never met. Sam Peters, I think I met as a child. Robbie Robbins, no, I didn't meet Sanus Robbins, but I sure heard a lot about him because he came down from Alaska with Joe. And by the way, he was also the captain of the Honolulu Clipper when it went down and was sunk. I just learned that a few weeks ago. Didn't know, what's his name? Richards, I can't read it. And there's Joe, and then Hamilton. Now these 9 pilots were all called out during the early 50s on this brochure by Pan American, and it just points out the fact that the number of crews in those days was nothing like airline personnel are now, to where they can go for years without ever flying with the same guy again, or even knowing him. There's the first page of a 3-page seniority list that I have. I'm just showing the first page. And I think it's interesting. This list was in 1949. I'm sure Some of you are on this list, if not on the first page, because most of these guys are gone. You'd be on the second and third pages. But starts off with their seniority numbers. And I imagine the missing seniority numbers in between there were probably people in the East Coast or the Southern Division. But it was quite a job, quite a deal to be a Pan American pilot, and I think it was right up till the end of the company. There's Bob Ford just below, Steve Bancroft, who I almost got named after, but my mother wouldn't allow it. Scotty Lewis, no relation to Rusty, but they were good friends. As you go on down the line, I'm having a Christofferson at the bottom. I can't read this too well from here, but Christofferson at the end was related to Ken Beer through their children. And Christofferson was the father of Chris Christofferson, the country and western singer. Grew up on the peninsula. And as you come down the list, I knew some of these fellows. Somebody said Ralph Savory was in here recently. Buckshot Lean. I kind of knew some of these guys, and I kind of just knew about them. And of course, the list goes on, but that's the list I have to show here today. Now, Joe started flying when he was about 14. He was building gliders, jumping out of barns and off knolls, and didn't do too well. They towed his first glider with a car, and the thing nosed up and stalled, and he got all skinned up, but he survived. When he was about 15, he ran away from home and tried to join the Army out at March Field. And his father was a Southern Pacific conductor. They found him out at March Field and told the Army he was underage, and the father said, well, if you'll come home and finish high school, I'll pay for your flying lessons. Now, there was two ways into Pan American in the old days, from what I gather, and I think you confirmed that today and yesterday. You either had to be a military pilot before the war, preferably Navy, or you came in as a bush pilot. Joe came in as a bush pilot because he never went to a day of college. But he sure finished high school, and his dad paid for his flying lessons. And the first airplane Joe soloed in was a Hisso Standard. Hisso Standard is different from a Jenny. Most of the old timers liked the Standard better than the Jenny. It was a little bigger and better flying airplane. That's an OX5 Standard right there, though. Standards originally had a Hall Scott engine in them, and they weren't worth a darn. They caught on fire a lot. Well, he's Joe 16 in that picture. He took flying lessons from the Mercury Flying Service down in Venice, California. And he'd had a ride with a guy named Swede Meyerhofer, a paid airplane ride. Oh, yeah, up in the Jenny. So he actually soloed. He couldn't put up the money for the airplane to solo, but he took care of the airplanes. He used to oil them and warm them up. So one morning, he just went out and soloed himself. And we found out this deep, dark secret when Joe was at a quiet birdman meeting, old hot timers night, about 25, 30 years ago. We were over at the city, and he was there, and he talked about his first solo, but when he got up to talking about doing it illegally, his voice kind of went low and he looked around. Joe was a cream puff, although he was a pretty tough guy. His first airplane, he had an OX5 Jenny, and he had met his wife-to-be, Mary, in San Jacinto in 1924. Well, he barnstormed around in those days up till about 24, from 1919 to 24. He barnstormed through Southern California, did all the crazy things, and he saw a friend of his killed in a Jenny doing aerobatics. The wing came off, and Joe kind of told me he resolved at that point to not get into aerobatics. He thought aviation had a better future than stunts, although that was the thing that paid the bills at times. But wing walking, they did some of the early stunt flying for the movies and some of the real old timers down there in Southern California. And in 1924, he wanted to get married, and Mary was a school teacher. She was up in Ashland, Oregon. He spent the summer trying to get to Ashland. That airplane broke down and cracked up, and he finally got up to Ashland, married Mary. He had to hawk his pistol to get the money for the marriage license. And they took off for Crescent City from Ashland. They got over the hills and they ran out of gas, and Joe put it down in the mountains in a meadow, and no damage to the airplane. They went to walk out, and it took them 2 days to walk out. He went back to get it later with more gasoline and cracked it up on takeoff, and they ended up bringing it out in a wagon, but he made some lifelong friends. After that, this is up in a place called Flat, Big Flat. There's some bearskins hanging on the propeller of that Jenny. Well, he and Mary bought a motel in Crescent City, an auto court, had a store, and they didn't do very well at it, but they ate the groceries. Then Joe, some benefactor, or an angel as they used to call him, financed Joe to the Jenny that I showed you at Santa Monica. That's the same airplane. Had oversized tires for landing on the beach, had a Hisso engine, and a closed cabin. Joe did quite well with that airplane until the business finally did fall off, and he moved south and went to work for Claude Ryan, flying the Hisso Standard, which Claude had flying for the Los Angeles to San Diego Airlines, reported by some people to be the first scheduled airline in this country. Although a lot of people make that claim, we don't know who's right. Now, when Joe was 14 or 16, about the time he started flying, he wrote to Curtis and became a Curtis dealer. They thought he was an adult. Curtis Orioles, he was a talker. And then after he flew for Claude Ryan, he had an incident down there. He was flying the Douglas Cloudster. I'll show you a picture of just a second. In fact, I'll show it to you right now. There's the Douglas Cloudster, and there's the Hisso Standards. This is at Lindbergh Field. They called it Dutch Flats in those days. There's Joe flying the M1 or M2. Actually, it's an M2 monoplane. While he was there, they got a contract with this. This was Donald Douglas's airplane, was the forerunner of the World Cruisers. It was a very big airplane, had a Liberty engine. They got a contract flying beer from a Mexican brewery to Tijuana. And the road washed out, so they would land the airplane up on this meadow. That's why they couldn't truck it out. And they would transfer the beer to the trucks and go on into Tijuana and ultimately, I guess, San Diego. Well, Joe went in there on a Friday night and he shut the engine down there about 3,000 feet above sea level. He shut the engine down as the last truck left. And he couldn't get the engine restarted. He had nobody to unload the airplane either. It was those bear barrels were pretty heavy. And so he's a chapter in Claude Ryan's book, Ryan the Aviator, and his title is The Bear Run. And Claude Ryan figured what happened. He flew down and saw Joe sitting there, and he flew away. They went back and called the newspapers in San Diego and got all the free publicity about the trip. And so they picked him up on Sunday, and the joke was he had nothing but beer to survive on for the weekend. They made quite a play out of it. Oh, I might add, when Joe was flying the Jenny off the beach in Crescent City, he was contacted by a fellow named Verne Gorst. And Joe took Verne Gorst around on some of his first surveys of that area from the air. And Joe told Verne, he says, he was doing it under contract to Verne. which was the beginning of Pacific Air Transport. He says, well, you really can't do well here on the coast because it's too foggy. They used the beach for the landing strips, a nice smooth beach, but the weather was so bad over on the coast that it just wasn't practical. And Joe was an early advocate of instrument flying when the instruments became available. But Gorst offered him a job, and Joe turned it down. He said, I don't think there's any future with this Patco company, which later became United Airlines. Yeah. And he did a lot of survey flying over the Colorado River for Ryan on contracts of aerial mapping, flying the Ryan monoplanes. Now there's Joe with his FAI, Fédération d'Aéronautique. I don't know when he first got it. That one says 1926, but he was flying long before that, 1919. He may have never had his FAI, or he might have had an earlier version, but that's the Douglas Cloudster in the background. So Joe in 1926, he's all of about 25 years old. Now there's Joe's air transport license, which he later got up in Oakland in 1927 when they passed the Air Commerce Act. They started licensing pilots. He qualified for a transport pilot, and he's number 255. And he got it on the second day they were giving the numbers. Of course, this varies. If you were on the East Coast, they had different blocks and numbers. So you could have a 1500 number and still be just as low and just as senior, basically. But for practical purposes, 255 is a nice sounding number. There's Joe, of course. This goes back to the beer run, when they were getting all the advertising, all the free publicity with Joe's expense. Joe went to Oakland, became a Fairchild dealer. He had a Fairchild dealer through a company called Low Motor Company. And he was in Oakland from 1927 to 30. He flew for part-time for Fairchild Aerial Surveys, flying FC-2s and Fairchild 71s, and he was known for being a good mapping pilot because he flew good altitude and good heading control for the overlapping pictures. He formed a company there called West Coast Air Service, and he taught his brother-in-law how to fly, a guy named Frank Moore, who some of you might have heard of at King City during the war. Frank Moore was in charge of the flight training program down there. And I have a very good friend of mine who was an Air West pilot that was an instructor there, and he tried to get a job with Pan American. He came up and interviewed in 41 with Joe, and he went back, and he never said a word, and Frank Moore called him in his office 2 days later. He says, well, what are you doing up talking to Pan American? And Mac could never figure out how Frank Moore knew that he had been talking to Pan Am, because in those days, the early part of the war, you didn't get away from the training command. They were really hot for pilots, hard up for them, and the airlines were too. So they really discouraged or wouldn't release him to go to work for the airlines. So he never got to go to work for Pan American, and he could never figure out how Frank Moore knew that he had been up talking to Joe at Pan American at Treasure Island. Until about 30 years later, I was talking to Mac one night, and I mentioned that Joe Barrows was Frank Moore's brother-in-law. And the light came on, and he says, son of a gun. Finally hit him. And we laugh about this to this day. In 1930, they went up to Vancouver or Victoria, and they tried to start a flying service based on the Low Motor Company's money. They had a Fairchild 51 and a Belenka, and later they bought a Fleetster. But they didn't do well in Victoria. They just didn't fit in with the community, and so the business was terrible. And he started running across a lot of guys from Alaska. Am I talking too loud or too soft? Okay. And they got the idea of going to Alaska, and they bid on one of the first Star airmail contracts. So they formed a company called Pacific International Airways, and they took the airplanes north to Alaska in 1930. Now, they landed right here at Telegraph Creek, British Columbia, to spend the night. And you can see they have the ever-present engine covers on the Fleetster there, which was a lot bigger than a Vega and had a metal fuselage and it had a Hornet engine. Cruised about 150. It was a pretty quick airplane for its day. On takeoff, his buddy, Fred Hammer, took off and the engine quit. And he cracked up on the lakeshore on the far side away, and there's the tail of the Fairchild sticking up. I believe this was a 71. Joe, being a newcomer to that area too, took off in a panic in the Fleetster, taxiing across the lake. Taxied onto thin ice, and the airplane broke through. The only reason he got out of it was he went through the top hatch. The Fleetster had a hatch in the top, and he went out that. And he got terribly injured and from the cold, and he had on a stretcher. They cut a lead, and they pulled the airplane over to the bank. And over a period of about 5 weeks, they got the airplane up and thawed it out. None of the instruments worked. They had to thaw it out as they raised it, and he flew it back to Anchorage, or back to civilization. And that was a pretty tough deal. Now, what I'm talking about here is hardship. What I'm saying is these old timers, they came up the hard way through some really tough times. Wherever you flew in an airplane in those days, even with a modern airplane, it was hard. You were pretty much on your own. The best airplane they had up there was this Belanca. By coincidence, he bought it from a guy named Blox Thornton, who was a Belanca dealer in Southern California, who actually turned out to be the deceased husband of Joe's fifth wife. That's another subject in itself. He outlived most of them. He divorced one, outlived three of them, and the fifth one outlived him. But he was never single for more than 6 months in his whole life, I don't think. My aunt was married to him for 24 years before she passed away. Anyway, they had this was on the Tanana River there over by Fairbanks, and this was a Pacific International airplane, and they had an arrow pointed, and the joke in Alaska used to be, that's how they could tell which way the plane was going. There's a picture of Anchorage in about 1930-31. Merrill Field is right there. This is 4th Street, which is the main drag. And of course, the International Airport's somewhere out here. The cemetery across from the Holiday Inn, I think, is that place right there. Anyway, it was a pretty small field in those days. There's a close-up of Merrill Field. This was, I believe, in 1931 when Hap Arnold came up there with the B-10 bombers. That was the biggest event they had. And so the field, this was summertime, of course. There's the PIA hangar. This all later became part of Pan American. Now, here's the PIA fleet. There's the Belanca, Fairchild 71s, the 51. I'm terrible with my eyes, I'll tell you. That's a Fleetster. That airplane right there, the 51, and the Belanca were the two best airplanes they had. I have a letter Joe wrote to the backers at Oakland about that time complaining about the 71. The 71s were pretty prevalent all over the world because they built a lot of them and they were a cabin plane, but they were a terrible bush airplane. There was a lot of them used in the bush, they just didn't get off. And I can show you copies of letters that Joe wrote complaining about them. The 51 got off good, the Belanca got off the best of them all. But when Pan American bought them out in 1932, Pan Am standardized on the 71 because there was more of them up there, and Alaska Airways that they merged with already had some 71s too. So being smart to standardize on parts. And they weren't really optimizing themselves for getting into that unusual strip. They were setting up more routine operations, which is smart. Now, seaplanes always have a problem of staying afloat. There was another picture of this same airplane. This looks like a Stetson. to where it looks like two kayaks in the water together. And it's the bottoms of the floats. And they had to right the airplane and get it out of the water. Now, how do you do all these things out in the middle of nowhere? You've got to improvise. Here's a 71. You can see it's got the label on there, the side for Pan American. I don't know what happened here. Probably an engine failure. It's a great picture, though. Here's another 71. You think about it, getting damaged out in the middle of nowhere took a pretty hardy guy and a pretty hardy crew to handle. Now, there was some mention yesterday of the Lockheed Cirrus when Lindbergh came through. Well, Joe had known Lindbergh from when his Ryan days when they were building the Ryan monoplane. And Lindbergh and Ann Murrow came through in 1931, and this is at Nome. Now, there's the tail of the airplane. Those stripes were for drift sights, drift estimation that the wife did. She was the navigator. There's Lindbergh, and there's Joe talking over something or other. Joe, at that time, Pacific International Airways was failing because their Angel in Oakland had died, and they had to liquidate the estate, and the money was all draining out of this company. Now, they had a contract to fly the mail, and they had to finish 1932. They had to fly into 1932. And in the meantime, Joe, through Lindbergh and Pan American's interest in flying the Northwest through to the Orient, bought Alaska Airways, and they bought Pacific International Airways and merged the two into the Pacific Alaska Company, a wholly owned subsidiary of Pan American, which later became the Pacific Alaska Division. Now, there's Al Monson. He's the fellow that went into the side of the hill. There's Joe, and there's 71. They took the arrow off. I guess they didn't need it anymore. As you could see, it wasn't a lot of fun. Those planes would sink into the snow. They'd have to dig them out. They'd have to sweep them off. They'd have to preheat the engine. Most of the time, they took the oil inside with them. It was exciting up there. They were competing with when Joe first went up there, they were competing with the dog teams and the trading posts, and they weren't accepted at first because the medium was dried salmon. That was where they made all their money, on the trading posts and for the dog teams. But they found out after the airplane was there a while that it increased their business. The dog teams took up other routes the airplanes couldn't get to, and the level of business just increased fantastically. And the airplane was quickly become to be loved in Alaska, but not at first. Now, there's Joe. I don't know where that picture was taken, either Anchorage or Fairbanks. That's a Stearman they had up there. It's in the Air Heritage Museum in Anchorage now. Mary, his first wife, he was married to her from 1924 to 1938. In about 1931, she took flying lessons. And Mary was the first woman to get her pilot's license in Alaska and be trained in Alaska. She learned from the Star Air Service. Now, as Pan American progressed, Joe was making trips to what they call the outside. They'd take him back to LaGuardia or Long Beach, I guess they called it, for those of you who are from that area. And Joe had to advise them on airplanes. Now, Ford had this airplane they wanted to unload, apparently, because I've seen this. It's had a Wright Cyclone, and it's a Ford, was it a 5AT, but it's called an 8AT. It was the only one ever built with one engine. And they had a big Hisso on it originally, a big, huge Hisso. They took it off and put a Wright Cyclone on it on extended engine mounts. And the airplane flew better than the tri-motor because it was easier to maintain, had less drag, burned less fuel, and had a better payload. Now, this airplane was used strictly as a freighter. They were not allowed to haul passengers in it. And this came along about 1933. And there's a great story in one of Joe's diaries about how he was back there at New York, and they were doing full aft CG tests. And he took off from the river there, and he got in the air, and the airplane went way no tail heavy, went nose up. He could hardly keep with full forward wheel and full throttle, he couldn't keep the nose down, he was hanging on a stall. Managed to get over a couple of bridges and landed in the water straight ahead. Wouldn't even think about banking, of course. And come to find out, he says, I took so-and-so's word for it. And he found cases of survival food loaded after the CG limits. So it was way out of weight and balance. And he says, I'll never take anybody's word for a weight and balance again. He says, this could have led to trouble. So this is Cordova. That's the strip. That's the airplane at Cordova. When the seasons changed, and the summer, they wanted to go on they're on skis and wheels in the winter. They wanted to go on to floats. Now, what do you do with a big airplane like that? You don't just have a crane to lift it up. Or if you have a crane, it's probably on a flat car. And that's what happened. Railroad siding here, strips here. How do you get the floats on the airplane? Well, you roll it onto a raft. You float the raft over across the lake to the shore near the railroad siding. You pick it up with a crane car and put the floats on it. And they move the floats around with an outboard motor. But those were huge, huge floats. It was things like that, it took people that had to think on their feet. And I think that's something common to all Pan American captains and crewmen. They're independent people. Some of them were quiet, some were boisterous. It was all types of personalities, but they had the common trait of intelligence. You all had the common trait of intelligence and imagination, and you loved aviation. And I think that was a highly considered factor there. Now, about 1934, Pan Am wanted to get some faster planes for some different routes in Alaska. So they sent Joe down to Brownsville. He checked out as a co-pilot and then later as a captain, spent about a month down there flying the Lockheed 10s into Mexico and Central America. And once he got qualified in the airplane, he split and they sent him to Burbank and he picked up a brand new Lockheed 10 and flew it to Alaska, where he checked everybody out. Now, they flew this airplane on wheels and skis, never on floats, of course. Interesting thing about it, that's Joe, that's Robbie, Sanus Robbins, the fellow that was later the captain of the Honolulu Clipper. I think that's Jerry Jones, and that might be Bill Knox, I'm not sure, or Al Monson. Joe Crossan is somewhere in here too. Again, I don't have my glasses off, and they look an awful lot alike. In Alaska, they were getting temperatures 60 and 70 below. So they put shutters on the fronts of the cowlings so they could stop them down, just like the f-stop on a camera, and control the amount of air going into the front of the engine. And also when they landed, they could shut these and it would hold the engine heat a little longer, if they wanted to shut down for a few minutes for refueling. Again, this is about 20 miles from Fairbanks, according to the note on the back. They made a forced landing with one of the Lockheeds out somewhere, and they had to change an engine. Well, how do you do it? You build an A-frame out of tree trunks. You get a chain fall. I mean, you got to give these guys a lot of credit. Now, there's Al Monson. I think that's Bill Knox, Joe Crossan, Joe Barrows. I think that's Jerry Jones. I don't know. I have all that. But you'll also notice the dirt floor in the hangar. This is Fairbanks. I think cement was pretty expensive in Alaska. They didn't waste it. Also, I don't know if it was necessary. The ground got pretty cold and frozen in the winter, In the summer, they probably make darn sure to keep it dry. I don't know what it was like. It looked like it'd been muddy in there. But anyway, they didn't have cement floors. Now, about 1935, Will Rogers and Wiley Post show up. I had the movie I had for years, a 16 millimeter, and I finally, Ted Spencer up in Anchorage, I sent it up to him, and he had a way of showing it without putting it on a sprocket. And he converted it to videotape, and it had the last known pictures, movies of Will Rogers and Wiley Post, taken the day before they were killed. And Joe Crossan, who was the chief pilot, Joe was the general manager. There's been a lot of controversy over that, but that's the way it was. I can prove it. They were great friends. They were in mining claims together, but they were both spirited guys. And Joe told me once, he said, we had friction. He says, we didn't have an exceptional amount of friction, but we were friends and we worked together. We both had our way of doing things, because Joe had been boss at Alaska Airways before. Now, those floats are the floats off of the Rogers plane before the crash. This picture might have been taken in Seattle. They were damaged and shipped back to New York to Edo, and they were shipped back to Alaska, but they were in Seattle, and Pacific Alaska lent these to Will Rogers and Wiley Post to put on their Orion, not knowing Lockheed had recommended against it because the CG was way off. These were Fairchild 71 floats. They were fairly heavy floats, and they made the airplane, contributed to its nose heaviness. There was an interesting story that came out of this, and I have it in Joe's diary. The day before the crash, Joe Crossan wanted to go to Point Barrow with Post and Rogers. And it's all written down in the book, and he wouldn't let him go. Joe wouldn't let him go. They told Post and Rogers, the weather's bad, wait a few days, things will get better, and then I'll send you, one of us can go up there with you. Because the problem was when they'd hit the coast there, they didn't know whether to turn right or left if you didn't know the area to go to Point Barrow. And there weren't a lot of alternates up there in those days. It was pretty much by itself. So Rogers landed on the river up there and was asking directions to Barrow. And when they took off, they think he either got carburetor ice or some kind of a fuel problem. The engine quit. The airplane swapped ends and crashed in shallow water and killed him. I have all the litany of how they went to dinner the night before, received word, Post and Rogers wired outside to do all possible. New York gave them permission to go up to Barrow, and they sent Joe Crossan up to Barrow to pick up Post and Rogers. I better hurry up with this thing. Now, Ocean Master Pilot, my golly. Pan American, Joe left Alaska in 1936, and his first wife wrote this in the book. She said, "Then like a bomb bursting came a wire from New York to this effect. Lay off all but 8 men as we are curtailing operations in the north. Joe Crossan will be the manager. You are transferred to Miami, Florida to fly there. Your transfer to take effect immediately." So they shut down operations. Pan American had decided that the route to the Orient was not, because of the Russians and the weather through the Aleutians, it was not the ideal place. And there was still business in Alaska, and they stayed there, but they cut back operations with the emphasis on it. Joe and Robbie left there almost immediately, and they went to Miami and started checking out originally the Commodore, and then the S-38, and the S-40, and the S-42. And they did that all in about 18 months' time. Joe accumulated about 2,000 hours down there in those airplanes. It took them about 3 weeks to check out in each airplane, but they spread them all over South America, in Cuba, and Merida, and Yucatan, and so on. And then after 18 months, Joe was transferred to Alameda to fly the M130. And Joe came out and checked out and flew about, best I can tell, about 3 to 4 months as a first officer, getting time and made trips to the Orient in the M130s. And then he was checked out as a captain. And the reason he didn't go through all the navigator and all the flight engineer stuff was because of his maintenance background in Alaska. And some of the other Alaskan pilots had the same experience. They already knew the mechanical side of things. And they were pretty tough guys. And I maintain going out to the Pacific in those days was like going to the moon. There wasn't a safety net out there. They went out on their own. When a Pan Am pilot cast off from Alameda, he was on his own. They were on their own as a team, of course. But there was not a lot of people out there and that's why those airplanes were so wonderful. The Sikorskys and the Martins and the Boeings were wonderful airplanes. They were just different points in technology. Now this shows July 9th, where Joe made one of his, I think he was checked out as a captain on the 130. And I notice up here, it's July 10th on his master pilot certificate, ocean pilot. Now this was developed because all they had was air transport ratings. They had nothing beyond that. They didn't have what we now know as the ATR or ATP rating. Pan American developed their own standard. They set up a training school for master ocean pilots, and they had to know nautical law, they had to know seamanship, they had to know weather, they had to know radio, and Pan Am had a real course going, and it wasn't easy to get through. I don't know, I'm sure some of you went through it, or maybe all of you did, I don't know, but I don't know when they stopped requiring this. And I think they did it up through the war. I have that logbook, and it's in my pocket right now. If anybody wants to look at it later, it's from 1936 up to 1941. Covers the Caribbean and the Pacific. Now, about 1940, Joe made a trip with a 314 down to New Zealand. He had this little 2.5-year-old girl he had to sign for. He was got her babysitter all the way down. But that's the kind of things Pan American did. She traveled alone. I have the article at home somewhere, but she doesn't look real happy. Now, there's the first flight to Singapore, 1941. There's Joe, Bob Howard, heard mentioned earlier. I knew Bob Howard. He lived in Saratoga. He's living in Las Vegas now. Tommy Wold, a lot of these other people, I don't know. But he flew the first flight to Singapore, and Barrows and Howard, they forgot the final word on this once they were in Manila. I think it was up in the air right up till the last minute whether they were cleared to do this. So they flew over to Singapore from Manila with the 314. This was the California Clipper. And there's Joe, of course, he's riding high. And the names of the people on there, the stewards and so on. Was there anybody here on that crew, by the way? Okay. I know one comment Joe made about the flight was they got there and there was this air marshal named Sir Brooke Popham, and I've read about him since, and he says the guy came up to us and he says, we've been flying for hours and we were tired, and he says, I bet you chaps would like a drink. And Joe and the rest of the crew says, boy, would we? And they gave him warm lemonade. And the guy made some statement, you chaps wouldn't want a drink, you're above that. And he says, no wonder they lost Singapore. Now there's Joe, I guess that's on one of the southern trips, because that's Joe dressed up like King Neptune. I don't know whether he's a victim or he's holding court. He's probably holding court. And I'm told a lot of the times when the weather was really hot, the crews stripped down to their shorts and flew pretty comfortably. They didn't hang around in sweaty uniforms. Oh, this was I think this is either Midway or Wake. I think it might be Wake, the Wake Hotel. That sandwich board was a sign he had in 1925 up in Crescent City, It says, "See our wonderful country, see the redwoods from the air." And he said I have it in the letter, he got off the airplane at Pearl City and was sitting on the walk. On another trip, he got off at Midway and it was on the dock. Wake and Guam. Last time he saw was a Cavite, and he says if there any Japanese know where that is, he'd like to get that sign back. When Manila fell, he lost the sign. There's when Joe was promoted to chief pilot in December, right after Pearl Harbor of 1941. He replaced Jack Tilton. Jack Tilton replaced Ed Music. They all knew each other. Tilton became division manager and Joe became chief pilot. Ken Beer was assistant chief pilot or chief pilot of training at San Francisco. Now, here's an interesting story. 2 clippers on Guam couldn't get off because of the weather. Some of you probably know this story. Maybe some of you were there. But anyway, they couldn't get off, so they had to get out, and they wanted to get out. They hired demolition people, and they blasted a channel through the reef. You know, again, it's people doing what they have to do. This was a special caliber of people. There's Joe in a lighter moment with Hilo Hattie. Somebody asked me yesterday if I was going to show this picture, and I said I wouldn't leave it out. It's one of my favorite pictures. But he's not feeling any pain, but he's out of uniform. That's probably at the Moana or the Royal, what? Yeah. I love that picture. There's Joe in the days of the Stratocruiser at San Francisco. Now, I was supposed to go for my first airplane ride with him in 1954. And that was in the days when they were shedding propellers like crazy because of that Hamilton electric prop. Well, I came up to go on a training flight. They used to let the families go on the training flights, and they changed the rule at the last minute, and I wasn't allowed to go. I was just brokenhearted, but I didn't cry. I was about 11 years old. Jim Fleming came down and apologized to me personally, set it up so I could go over and fly the Link trainers in the training building. And Colonel Young came down. Clarence Young was the division manager. And I never figured out why they had a colonel working for Pan American. And luckily I met Clarence Young. And they were all so good to me as a kid. That's why one of the reasons I fell in love with Pan American. I know a lot of Pan Am pilots out in Saratoga. There's the Stratocruiser, of course, including Dick Ogg, who put one down out there. Now, Joe was flying made friends with a merchant captain on the radio, met him somewhere, I think it was at Long Beach later, and they swapped stories. Joe made a trip on the merchant captain's ship. There's Joe in the cockpit of a Stratocruiser with Captain Hansen. Now there's Joe and the ever-popular Wally Dean, the picture taker. And Joe hired Wally in 1942. I don't know who that is. Does anybody give me a name on that? Young-looking guy. The last picture I have of Joe, now he went on to fly the jets. He went on to fly 6s and 7s. He flew the Connies. He didn't care much for the Connie. He said they had a lot of false engine fires, lights. Pan Am didn't last long in this division. He flew the 6s and 7s and 4s, and he didn't get excited, and I didn't. And you know, it's like I took flying lessons when I was 16, and he would let me shoot all his guns, but he'd never talk flying. Once I took my own flying lessons, it was like buying a ticket. Joe took me under his wing, and we became fast pals. And he taught me a lot about flying. One of them was never to take yourself too seriously. And he says, if you ever feel like you're doing something dumb, and he used worse language than that, he says, just think about it first. And I did. There were times I thought, well, what would Joe do? Would he think this was a smart move? And by golly, that's not bad advice from anybody. I gave it to a few students too. Now, Jerry Mahan, this was taken at the Watsonville Air Show, one of the last pictures I have of Joe. Walt Adams, who was chief pilot of United Airlines. Jimmy Nissen, who flew as a junior crewman at Pan American for a while before he went to work for the NACA as a test pilot, and Joe. Now, I flew a Cessna 310 for Joe for a number of years. He never could get his medical back. I want to tell one story about Joe real quick about that. He went back to United Flight Service at Watsonville and applied to go take some dual. Well, a friend of mine, Dan Chevet, who was the chief pilot and later became the chief pilot of Granite Construction, flying jets for him, said this man comes in and he says he wanted to take some dual. And he says, oh boy, the older guy, and he says he probably had some training in the GI Bill, and you know, that's about it. He didn't expect much. And he says Joe pulled out his license and shows him this ATR with types from the 707 all the way down to the M130. And Dan says, well, who's going to teach who, Mr. Barrows? But that was one thing about Joe. They took him out, and Joe was very unassuming, very good with altitude control. He was always listening to people, never was a know-it-all, and just a great guy. I had one experience when I was in high school. I flew he and my aunt over to Nuttry for lunch, and one of her girlfriends, in a 182, one of the early 182s. And by the time we got out of the restaurant, the weather just turned to hell. And I took off, and I'm heading back to San Jose, and I couldn't get over the hills. I mean, the weather was right down to the mountaintops. Joe got on the radio. He was still flying at the time with the Pan American. He got on the radio and just checked everything out. I figured, oh, with him along, we won't have any trouble, you know. And he says, well, it's closed in everywhere. I said, well, what should we do, Joe? And Joe looked at me and he says, you're the pilot. I thought, oh my God, I'm going to do a 180. And we went to Watson, we went to Napa and went to Jones. He had a steak, ended up taking the bus home. Took us till midnight to get home. But that was just a heck of a lesson, and I found that to be true. Don't ever take people's responsibility away from them. Let them learn. He wouldn't have let me do anything dumb, but he wasn't telling me what to do every second. And I think that's important. And that was the, and I've talked to a lot of the first officers, and I'm sure many of you in this room, he always let people do the flying. He says, when you have a co-pilot, he says, you want that co-pilot to be the best guy in the world because he's going to save your bacon someday. He says, don't lord it over him. He says, you be good to him and it'll pay off. And that's about it. He flew 707s and we flew the 310 together. That's about it. Thank you. One other thing I almost forgot. I have Joe's. I have his master pilot certificate here. And I'm donating it to this museum and library in memory of Joe Barrows and all you Pan American people.
Thank you, my friend. Magnificent. Thank you, Gordon. What a tremendous artifact and a very insightful and personal story, Gordon. We thank you so much for that. This is a surprise and an honor, and we'll find a place of suitable dignity here in this developing institution. Thank you very much.